Hello and welcome to another one video. What would happen if all the oxygen in the atmosphere disappeared for 1 minute? Depending on the nature of this disappearance, we'd be looking at either up to a billion dead or just several tens of millions. First off, there are 3 ways you could imagine this happening. Scenario 1, the oxygen in the atmosphere just vanishes and then reappears a minute later. This would be essentially similar to opening the door to an airliner cruising at 13,000 feet with normal cabin pressure. 3 psi pressure drop. This doesn't sound like a lot until you multiply it over a large surface. 3 pounds per square inch is over 2 tons per square meter. Additionally, what happens then depends on the definition of the atmosphere. If the oxygen disappears from all volumes, including inside enclosed spaces such as buildings, then you'll most likely see minor structural damage to buildings and infrastructure as many tons of air pressure suddenly disappear. Your average detached house, in the UK at least, would be losing around 800 tons of air pressure over its outer surface, not to mention the interior. A skyscraper could be losing 16,000 tons of air pressure on its outer surface. How these structures would relax is one question. How these structures would withstand the sudden reappearance of this load is another. Structure damage from this flexing is likely, but actually larger buildings would be more likely to withstand this as they have to have a degree of flexibility anyway. If air enclosed in buildings was not included in the above transaction, then things just got a whole lot worse. A 3 psi explosive shockwave is enough to knock down small buildings, heavily damage brick walls and cause potentially life-threatening injury. It would also be extremely loud. Skyscrapers would explode their glass outwards and then would experience crushing inward forces a minute later. To picture the blast, imagine a sudden 110 miles per hour wind or being around 1.25 miles from the Hiroshima detonation, minus the heat and radiation. The equivalent circle would be the 2,000 meters one, the one approximately encircling the yellow band. These effects would be largely on top of the effects listed in scenario 2, although the pressure drop may cause people to hold their breaths, which would be life-saving. The death toll would be extreme. Approaching a billion seems plausible. What about the other way? Scenario 2, the oxygen is replaced by nitrogen or the oxygen simply disappears, but somehow its pressure remains. This time around, it's far less devastating, but many lives are lost. The first danger here is that we wouldn't notice. We can't detect the presence of oxygen and we don't choke on nitrogen, which is a good thing. Pretty much the only way we have of knowing if an atmosphere is unbreathable is if there's too much CO2, which does cause us to choke. This is part of why liquid nitrogen and nitrogen gas leaks in labs etc. are quite dangerous. During a practice drill for the first Space Shuttle mission STS-1, to prevent fire, the Space Shuttle cabin was filled with nitrogen. A procedural change meant that 3 technicians were allowed to enter the cabin before the nitrogen had been purged. All 3 rapidly lost consciousness. A 4th saw them and tried to help and lost consciousness too. A 5th, seeing the 4th, went to assist and suffered the same fate. Only when a guard, with an air pack, went in, were they rescued. The first 3 all died of their exposure, 2 at the time, the 3rd years later, although was severely brain damaged in the interim. We wouldn't know to hold our breaths. Each lungful of air would have no oxygen in it. In fact, by continuing to breathe, you'd be expelling any remaining oxygen in your blood with each exhale. Exhaled air has between 13 and 16% oxygen in it remaining. With each pump of our hearts we would start circulating deoxygenated blood around our bodies. It takes about 20-30 seconds for that deoxygenated blood to reach your brain, at which point you'll extremely rapidly lose consciousness. Note that even when the oxygen comes back, assuming you're still breathing, would depend on your overall health, resting heart rate etc. It'll still take time for the oxygenated blood to circulate to your brain and heart. If you were vigorously exercising or exerting yourself when the oxygen disappeared, you'd be at much higher risk. For some people, especially the elderly and those in poor health, this would be too much and they wouldn't wake up. Some might recover to be brain damaged, more will have had heart attacks, or will have gone into respiratory arrest and would need emergency medical care. If you were asleep when this happens, you'd be more likely to survive sleep apnea of a minute, while a serious indicator of health problems is something many people wouldn't even notice. However, many more will have died on the roads as uncontrolled vehicles plow into each other, as the drivers lose consciousness, and any aircraft coming into land that wasn't on autopilot would crash, and I'm not sure how well the autopilot could handle sudden engine power loss. Higher altitude airliners would be safe as they can glide for far longer than a minute. In fact, the first some people would know of the disappearance of oxygen is that their car engine would die on them. This would be almost immediate. It would also reduce the fatalities in the crashes, as the vehicles would lose speed, but they'd also lose power steering, and some might lose brake power too. The various crashes would be unusual. Debris and metal shards would fly about, but no sparks would appear or fireballs. Fuel cannot burn without oxygen, so the more dramatic smashes would leave petrol, diesel and aviation fuel everywhere. Naturally, a minute later when the oxygen comes back, some of these accidents, including some of the survivors, could burst into flame. A conservative figure for the final death toll worldwide would be several tens of millions. A third scenario exists where all oxygen is read to be all oxygen atoms. This would now include atmospheric water vapor, which would vanish, leaving behind hydrogen. Would there be enough for explosions? I'll run the numbers to check. Every gram of lost water in this fashion would generate 1.25 ml of hydrogen gas. In ultra-humid conditions, 100% humidity at 36 degrees centigrade, these conditions would be at the outer limit of human survivability BTW. The moisture content in the air could reach 52 ml of hydrogen per cubic meter of air. The lower explosive limit for hydrogen in regular air is around 18%, so that 52 ml can cause an explosion, provided it is mixed with less than 300 ml of air. A cubic meter is 1 million ml. So this process cannot, even in a worst-case scenario, turn the air overall explosive. However, a minute is quite a long time, and more than enough time for hydrogen to accumulate in contained spaces at ceilings. This would leave me to conclude that in either scenario 1 or 2, an additional hazard when the oxygen comes back is that poorly ventilated buildings in humid areas will likely experience hydrogen explosions. Hydrogen-air mixtures are ridiculously easily ignited. This also applies to anyone using flammable pyrophoric gases liquids who may not turn the supply off and end up with these compounds exposed to the freshly returned air. A large number of fires will also result.